This is the summary of my live observation in the personal choice category, and it was an employment setting. The company is a large international company with related to the oil business and pipelines, and so a lot of their business is IT dependent, technology dependent, computers dependent. And the deaf person who is involved in this setting is a computer programmer. The observation took place at an office tower downtown. The deaf employee's office is on a secured floor, and the observation took place both in his own personal office as well as a boardroom. As we continue in the environmental demand category, terminology in this setting is highly specific and highly technical. Things like break fix that have their own signs specific to this employment setting. Remedy, it's not remedy, it's remedy. Server is signed, actually here, server, a computer server. Other technical terms that came up that I made note of were things that were tickets, and we're not talking about movie, and SQL View, SharePoint, lots of acronyms like PCSLD, LRS records, and then as well the names of other co-workers or other people higher up on the org chart came up. The participants were the deaf man, who's a white male, about 50, and has been working at the company for about 25 years in this IT role. There were 3 peers, that's the white hearing peers, ages 30s to 50s, who appeared to be on the same level of the org chart as the deaf man. So then the 4 of them, and then the 1 supervisor who is a male, white, 40s I would say, and the 1 interpreter, white and in her 30s. So the interpreter came to the assignment with a number of very effective controls. She has about 15 years of experience. She's been working in this particular setting and with this particular deaf person for some years. In this particular contract, I think it's been 3 years or so, but has certainly worked with him on and off, for a decade. With this background, she possesses context and knowledge of the corporation, the deaf employee's role within the company, the names and roles of co-workers, supervisors, and the department's organizational structure, as well as the more overall company structure. So in this particular setting, the deaf person has interpreters who come every afternoon from 1 to 4, and 2 interpreters currently share that role. One works Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the other works Tuesday, Thursday, or some combination along those lines. And during the afternoons, they work alone, and they work in settings like one-on-one meetings. They interpret phone calls. They do some translation work from ASL to written English. So the deaf person saves all those kinds of interpretation needs or communication needs that require the interpreter there, or interpretation services, for the afternoons. The interpreter has her own security card to get into the secure elevator and onto the secured floor. In the deaf person's office, pardon me, when we went, obviously I met her in the lobby, and then we went up to the elevator to the correct floor, and we went in, and there's a deaf person, and I've known him for 2 decades as well, and I've hardly ever interpreted for him because I've been at the university full time, so not available to be, during the work day. Pardon me. So the interpreter goes in, we say, the afternoon greetings and so on, and interpreter opens the cupboard and pulls out her coffee cup, and down we go to the kitchen where there's really quite a modern, fancy kitchen that has multiple, I think they're called Keurig coffee cartridges that you can pick different flavors or make yourself some specialty teas, and lots of filtered water, things you can just help yourself to. And so she made herself a coffee to start the afternoon and offered me one, and it just showed me the control of, pardon me again, the control of knowing the space, knowing people, making greetings, having a context for the entire interpersonal tone of the floor in the office. So I'll go into a little more detail about my observations. I want to describe first demand as more of a category, and that is the environmental demand of the highly technical and specific terminology. The responses to this, the controls that the interpreter uses, are certainly pre-assignment preparation. Any material regarding what's going to be discussed that afternoon or for that meeting, whether it's a one-on-one or a group meeting or whatever that is, the interpreter prepares for with any kind of paperwork she can get from the deaf person or online. For meetings, she reviews the agenda and any content that she can in advance with the deaf employee. He will give her things to read, job assignments or projects that he's been assigned. They can read, and they have, as an additional control, created this communication book. And I think you may have seen the image I attached to Blackboard, and I will attach with this assignment, that they communicate on a daily basis about what's happened, what's going on. And I think the page I photographed for you showed a flow chart of a particular project, and then the pieces that certain employees are responsible, the kind of categories that it's covering in the overall project, and in that way they can review this information before they begin whatever assignment they're going into. As well, they communicate on down the line about what's going on. The other part about the specific technical terminology that this interpreter comes in to the setting with controls to really analyze for meaning based on known context, but based on grammatical cues. So I was making the comment in my Blackboard posting about me observing this and thinking, this is, I'm in the middle of a Jabberwocky poem, because they are communicating and I can watch the interpreter. I was feeling like I understood much better with the interpreter's interpretation, and she certainly used space, like they were talking about pages. Well, I didn't think it wasn't paper pages, but she did things like this, and was really interpreting for meaning based on the linguistic, the prosody, and the contextual content cues that she was receiving. And just one example is that I felt I understood was the comment, business doesn't like IT. And I felt the implicit meaning was that a unit in that corporation that is named business doesn't like their unit. And it may have had even deeper implicit meaning that one or two people that they know, but I don't know, but that was identifying one or two people who in that unit called business doesn't like their IT unit. So I think that having some context, listening to that prosody, putting all together the pieces of the puzzle. We're not talking about business. The market of business doesn't like the market of IT. I think we were talking obviously about inside and internal dynamics. So that's just an example of trying to get at the meaning based on what you're hearing in their almost code-like discussions. So that's the first demand I wanted to talk about as a more gestalt demand of the specific terminology and the different controls that the interpreters are bringing to it. The research, looking in the dictionary, have discussions with the deaf person. It's all an overarching demand of this in setting. And then now I'd like to go into the second demand, and that's more specific to my observation there of what happened. And what happened was the deaf person needed to phone someone to talk about some work. I think it's called a ticket. So he got a ticket. He needed to correct something in a program. So the ticket had a number of instructions. Please change this field. Please do that. Please, a number of things to do. And the deaf person needed to contact the person in question, the hearing person, to clarify, did you mean, needed to clarify, was it this or this will cover this? This means the same thing as that. The point I'm trying to get at is before the telephone conversation was started, the deaf person showed all the information to the interpreter and was pointing to fields and pointing to columns and rows and saying, this is what I've done, this is what they asked me to do, this is what I'm not sure, and gave the interpreter and the interpreter asked questions to get enough controls in order to meet the demand of the technical terminology and the technical discussion that needed to take place on the telephone. An additional technology control she had was a headset that made it hands-free. And she puts on the headset, the deaf person punches in the phone number. They also agreed previous to making the phone call that if the interpreter got or heard the answering machine go on, that a message would be left that basically was just summarizing what the deaf person had said. So the demand was, again, the technical terminology. The control was to get all that information in advance. And the positive consequence was that the interpreter had more controls because she knew precisely what was going to be discussed. So she had the terminology, she had a chance to rehearse some of the sentences in her head before it was signed in American Sign Language. And I mean, the negative consequence of this is that it takes more time for the deaf person, out of the deaf person's day, to prepare the interpreter. But it really minimizes the resulting demands in terms of things going smoothly during the conversation. And so when I observed this particular phone call, it turned out that the answering machine picked up the call. So then the deaf person signed his message, and she interpreted the message, and it went quite smoothly. During the rest of the afternoon, I did not observe a return call from the hearing person, so I don't know if there were any resulting demands from the interpretation that left the receiver of the message confused in any way. The third demand I want to describe is my observation of a team meeting that was held down the hallway in a boardroom. the setup was an oblong style boardroom table, and the supervisor who was chairing the meeting was at the one end, the head of the table. At the other end on the wall was a screen, and there was a computer, I think like just a keyboard that anybody could use. It was wireless, and then be able to project anything that they were either typing or getting from the net or whatever up onto the screen. So in this setup, the interpreter was sitting across, the deaf person was sitting on one side of the table, the interpreter was sitting on the other side of the table. The supervisor, as I said, was at the head of this table. There were two of the other team members, peers to the deaf person, on the side where the interpreter was, and then there was another peer who was on between the deaf person and the supervisor. So that was the setup. A total of 6 people, including the interpreter. I was sitting away from the table, back up against the wall. So the demand I want to describe here, it was a paralinguistic main demand. The interpreter could not hear actually it was the participant that was sitting beside the supervisor on the side of the table, the same side as the deaf person. And so she could see him, but she was having trouble hearing him. And he was quite soft-spoken, and I too had trouble hearing him. And even though it wasn't a large room, you should be able to hear everyone, but he was that soft-spoken that it was difficult. And so the first time she couldn't hear him, she tilted her body this way to show the deaf person she was concentrating on hearing, on the focus on what he was saying, and see if she could catch it. And then she would so that was one control, showing the body. The second was she would just told the deaf person, I can't hear him, I can't hear him. And it was clearly indicated who she could not hear. And I just want to make a reference at this point that this is what Napier calls a conscious receptive omission. And those are omissions that the interpreter is aware of, but cannot properly decipher because of poor sound quality or inability to hear. So the interpreter is conscious that information is missing, but can't, we all have controls. And in this regard, her control was to let the deaf person know. I'm just finding my place again. So the positive consequence is that the deaf person is informed of the interpreter's inability to hear, the difficulty hearing the soft-spoken participant, and that information is missed. So of those controls, that is a positive consequence. And I would suggest another is that the meeting is not interrupted and attention is not drawn to the interpreting process. So those are fairly down the conservative range of the continuum. A negative consequence was that information was missed, not retrieved. And another negative consequence was that other participants did not know that the interpreter could not hear. Perhaps they were able to judge the body language, but it was not explicit that the interpreter was having difficulty hearing. So that could be perceived as a negative consequence. And the resulting demand was that the interpreter, not just the deaf person, but the interpreter obviously does not know what was said. And so there's some loss of content and context. What I observed throughout the meeting was that this particular demand repeated itself. I would say there was 3 times where she couldn't hear and she let the deaf person know. I would say it was about the 4th time she chose an alternate control and she said, Paul, could you just speak up a bit? I'm just having a hard time hearing you. Would you mind just raising your voice so I can hear? It was done, I thought, with a little bit of a chuckle or a laugh. I felt not threatening, it was polite, and I think he did indeed raise his voice enough for the remainder of the meeting, that she didn't have to fall back to another control if having it happen again. So in the post-assignment discussion that she and I had, I talked to her. I really wanted to explore some of the controls used in that meeting. I asked her about sitting where she did. It wasn't next to the chairperson, so I asked her to tell me a little bit more about that. And most of the controls employed in that setting were at the request of the deaf person. So he has made it very clear in those meetings he does not want the interpreters to interrupt. Interpersonal dynamics happening there, he does not want attention drawn to the interpreting process. He does not want the interpreter to interrupt. I perceived it mainly if the interpreter doesn't understand that they shouldn't interrupt, and not so much when, well, I mean, the interpreter let him know, I can't hear, I can't hear. And it did reach an interpersonal demand, the level of an interpersonal demand, that she had to make a more liberal decision to say, could you just speak up because I'm having trouble hearing you? Because two pieces, she was uncomfortable with not being able to hear, and them not knowing that fact being ignored. And she wanted to have the content and the context herself, because clearly it's dynamic and it's adding to this discussion, and the fact that she can't hear it makes it a gap in her own understanding of the material that she's responsible to interpret. So it was a very good discussion, her telling me about the interpersonal demands of this particular work setting. When it's a team meetings, no interruptions. When it's training, interrupt as much as you need, because I need to know exactly what's going on. Whereas a team meeting, it's not that he doesn't need to know what's going on, but he has other controls where to get information that he's not understanding based on the interpretation gaps. And then thirdly, as I was saying, with the telephone calls or one-on-one and the interpreter's not understanding, then there can be more controls used that are liberal to say, I'm not clear on that, can you just repeat that piece for me? Those kinds of things are okay. So from the deaf person's interpersonal dynamics description of what he requires and what the setting requires. So I think that really summarizes the three demands I wanted to go through. I did attach that image of the communication book for the students and your review. I just thought that the level of controls brought to preparation were excellent for this particular team of interpreters. Just allow me to review my notes here for just a few more minutes. Yes, I think that concludes what I wanted to share about this, but I expect I will be doing this for my case presentation, so I have more to share. Thank you.